We've covered how to chain promises together and delved into a real-world example with the JavaScript fetch request. In this session, we'll go over a few remaining details on promises, specifically the promise.resolve, promise.reject, promise.all, and promise.race functions. Promise.resolve, in its simplest form, creates a promise that is already in a resolved state. With one exception, the optional argument of the function is whatever the promise should be resolved with. This could be useful for testing promise chains to ensure everything works as expected. Here's an example of a promise.resolve call. Creating a promise in this manner is identical to writing this. There's an alternative way to use promise.resolve. If the argument specified is an object that has a then function in it, the argument is considered thenable. I know, it's weird. And how the function resolves will determine the promise resolution. Here's the basic syntax for an argument with a thenable method. And here's one with a delay. The then function in the thenable object looks similar to a promise constructor. It has two arguments, resolve and reject. Calling those functions will resolve or reject the outer promise. This syntax is identical to constructing a promise like this. Remember that the functions passed into the then function need to be invoked in order to resolve or reject the promise, or an error needs to be thrown. Just having a then function return a value will result in a promise that will never resolve. Although the thenable object is passed in as an argument of the promise.resolve function, it can result in a rejected promise. For example, thenable objects can be nested inside each other as well. Here's an example of three nested object/function calls. Which would be identical to this. So, to create a promise in an already resolved state, or evaluate a promise-like thenable object, you can use the promise.resolve function. In order to create a promise that is already in a rejected state, use the project.reject function. The syntax is almost identical. Here's an example of promise.reject. Which is identical to Promise.reject does not handle thenable objects like promise.resolve. If you call promise.reject with such an object, it will just return that object as a reason for why the promise was rejected. Whenever a promise is created, it will immediately execute the function passed in the constructor function, or as defined in the then function in the case of a promise.resolve thenable argument. We've already gone over how promises could be chained together to perform sequential operations. But what about tasks that have several actions that are expected to be executed in parallel? The promise.all function takes an array of promises as an argument and returns a promise that will resolve successfully with an array of values if all the promises succeed, that is, resolve, or it'll reject if any of the promises fail. Here is an example. Notice that although the bread promise resolves immediately, the promise returned from promise.all does not resolve until all of the promises are in a resolved state. The cheese promise will resolve before the all promise resolves. The array argument passed in the promise.all can be of any length, including 0, and it does not need to contain promises. If the array length is 0, the promise is resolved immediately, and its resolved value is an empty array. If something other than a promise is passed in, it will be passed directly into the resolved array. This can be combined with promises, like this. If one promise inside the promise.all array ends up in a rejected state, the promise returned will reject. Running promises in parallel and then moving on to another action is very common and can be combined with promise chaining. In rare cases, you may want to have a promise resolve if at least one of the specified promises complete. A possible scenario might be that you want a progress bar to appear once one of several actions has completed. The promise.race function will return a promise that resolves once one of the promises specified moves out of a pending state. The returned promise's resolution depends on the resolution of whichever promise moves out of pending first. Here's an example combined with a promise.all call. Promise.race behaves very similarly to promise.all. Besides the behavior, the main difference is what is returned. The winning value, or the value of whichever promise is resolved first, is what is returned, or resolved with. Values other than promises can also be passed into the promise.race call, but they will always result in the promise resolving immediately, the first non-promise value being the result. Unlike promise.all, promise.race cannot accept an empty array as an argument. The promise returned will never resolve. If the first promise to move out of a pending state is rejected, the promise returned from promise.race will end up in a rejected state as well. For example, the first promise in this array fails 300 milliseconds before the successful promise. But if the delays are flipped, the promise succeeds. So that should cover most of the concepts of promises in native JavaScript. In this session, we covered how to create an already resolved or rejected promise via promise.resolve and promise.reject, discussed thenable objects and how they can be used with promise.resolve, and went over the built-in functions promise.all and promise.race.